It defied logic. It defied God. 20 meters ahead, something crossed the trail. Not a bear, not a deer. Something that walked upright. Something that stopped, turned, and locked eyes with him in the fading light. The encounter lasted seconds, long enough to see details that would stay with him, long enough to understand he was looking at something that shouldn't exist. He didn't run. His faith steadied him. He simply backed away, slowly, deliberately, treating the sighting as divine warning to turn back. What follows is an examination of that encounter, the specific details observed, the location where it happened, and the accumulated evidence suggesting he wasn't the first to see something in these woods that moves between the documented and the impossible. The Ozark Trail stretches 430 miles across southern Missouri, winding through the Mark Twain National Forest and into the lake regions that draw millions annually. The trail system is well maintained, clearly marked, and extensively documented. Trailheads feature detailed maps. Water sources are identified. Camping zones are designated and regularly inspected. Over 350,000 hikers use the Ozark Trail system each year. Families camp at developed sites. Day hikers explore the bluff systems. Backpackers tackle multi-day segments through terrain that challenges without overwhelming. The Missouri Department of Conservation employs full-time staff dedicated to trail maintenance and visitor safety. Rangers patrol regularly. Emergency protocols are established and tested. Cell service reaches many sections. Popular trails see dozens of hikers on weekend mornings. The Tom Sauk section attracts photographers capturing the highest point in Missouri. The Courtois section draws experienced backpackers to its creek crossings and ridge walks. Most visitors complete their journeys without incident, returning home with nothing more than photos and fatigue. The forest itself presents manageable challenges. Black bears inhabit the region but avoid human contact. Timber rattlesnakes exist in rocky areas, their presence well documented and understood. Weather patterns can shift, particularly in spring and fall, but forecasts are reliable and rangers brief visitors on conditions. The terrain includes steep sections, ridge walks, and creek crossings, all mapped and graded for difficulty. This is not remote wilderness. Towns dot the periphery. Roads intersect the trail at regular intervals. Rescue access exists throughout the system. The infrastructure supports safe recreation for those who prepare appropriately and respect the environment's documented characteristics. Yet within this accessible, well-managed landscape, observations accumulate, not folklore, not legend. Documented reports from credible witnesses describing encounters that resist standard explanation. Reports that share specific characteristics. Reports that cluster in particular corridors of the trail system. The retired clergyman's encounter in October 2011 adds to this accumulation. The man had served in ministry for 38 years before retirement. His first assignment came in 1971, fresh from seminary, to a congregation of 47 members in the Missouri Ozarks, a white clapboard church with a hand-pumped organ and folding chairs that creaked during Wednesday night prayer meetings. He learned ministry there in the fundamental way it's always been learned, through presence, through listening, through showing up when families faced crisis or celebration. Over nearly 4 decades, he served 6 different congregations across rural Missouri and Arkansas. Never the large churches in Springfield or Branson, always the small communities where the pastor knew every family by name, where Sunday service was followed by potluck dinners in fellowship halls that smelled of coffee and casseroles, where his role extended far beyond the pulpit into hospital visits, counseling sessions, community events, and the daily texture of rural life. He married 114 couples, baptized 267 children and adults, conducted 183 funerals. These weren't statistics to him, but names, faces, stories. The young couple who'd eloped and wanted the church's blessing. The 70-year-old man who'd finally made peace with faith after a lifetime of resistance. The families who brought him into their grief and trusted him to speak words that might ease what couldn't be fixed. His theology was traditional but not rigid. He believed in scripture, in prayer, in the fundamental goodness of God's creation. He'd witnessed enough unexplainable occurrences over the years, moments of grace or coincidence that defied pure materialism, to maintain an openness about what existed beyond documented knowledge. But he wasn't superstitious. He didn't attribute every mystery to divine intervention or supernatural forces. His faith coexisted comfortably with reason. He retired in 2009 at age 65, his body showing the accumulation of decades spent on his feet, in cars driving between parishioners' homes, in the physical labor of maintaining small church buildings that couldn't afford separate maintenance staff. His knees ached, his lower back complained after long days, but his mind remained sharp, his faith intact, his need for purpose still present even as formal ministry ended. He settled in a small town near the Ozark Trail's Trace Creek section. A modest house, affordable on his retirement income, close enough to former parishioners to maintain connections, far enough from his last congregation to allow the new pastor room to establish leadership. The location offered something he'd rarely had during his working years: solitude, quiet, time for reflection, without the constant demands of pastoral care. Walking became his routine, 3 to 4 times weekly, weather permitting. The forest provided what his years of service had rarely allowed: extended silence, space to think without interruption, physical activity that cleared his mind. He preferred the late afternoon, starting around 4:30 p.m., timing his return for just before full dark. The pattern was consistent, predictable, safe. The Ozark Trail's Trace Creek section became his regular route. He'd walked it enough times to notice seasonal changes: the spring wildflowers along the creek drainage, the summer canopy that created cathedral-like shade, the autumn colors that transformed the hardwood forest into layers of red, orange, and gold, the winter bare branches that opened sightlines and changed the forest's character entirely. October 17, 2011 followed this established pattern. The temperature reached 61 degrees by late afternoon, unseasonably warm for mid-October. Clear skies, the kind of crystalline clarity that comes after a cold front passes through. No wind, the stillness that makes every sound in the forest carry further than usual. He entered the trail at the Trace Creek access point at 4:42 p.m. He noted the time out of habit, the same awareness of schedule that had governed his pastoral work for decades. Morning hospital visits, afternoon counseling sessions, evening committee meetings. Time remained a framework even in retirement. He intended a 2-mile out and back walk, a route he'd completed at least 40 times since settling in the area. The trail wound through mixed hardwood forest: white oak, black oak, shagbark hickory, sugar maple. The autumn colors were near peak. Leaves still on trees, but showing the full intensity of their color change before the inevitable fall. The path itself was well maintained, clearly marked with the standard Ozark trail blazes, white rectangles painted on trees at regular intervals. The trail width varied from 4 to 12 feet depending on terrain. In places where it crossed ridgetops, the path widened naturally. In sections cutting through dense forest, it narrowed to single track. He walked at his usual pace, steady but not hurried, approximately 2 miles per hour. Fast enough for cardiovascular benefit, slow enough to notice his surroundings. The rhythm of walking freed his mind for prayer, reflection, processing thoughts that had accumulated during the day. The forest that afternoon was quiet in the way October forests are. Most songbirds had migrated. Insects were dying back with the cooling temperatures. The sounds were subtle, leaves rustling in the minimal breeze, his own footsteps on the packed earth trail, the occasional creak of a tree settling. The light was fading but still adequate at 5:15 p.m. Sunset was scheduled for 6:07 p.m., meaning civil twilight. The sun had dropped below the tree canopy, but the sky remained bright. Visibility extended 20 to 30 meters in most sections, more than sufficient for safe hiking. He rounded a gentle left-hand curve in the trail, an area he'd walked dozens of times before. The path descended slightly toward a small creek drainage. Oak trees dominated this section, their trunks thick with age, their roots creating subtle undulations in the trail surface. 20 meters ahead, something moved across the trail from the right side to the left. His first impression, processed in a fraction of a second, was size. larger than a man, significantly larger, 7 feet tall at minimum, possibly taller. The immediate comparison his brain made was to a standing bear, but the movement was wrong. Bears on 4 legs don't reach that height. Bears standing upright on hind legs rise to that height, but don't walk with that kind of fluidity. They lumber, waddle, move with the awkwardness of an animal in an unnatural position. This walked upright with the ease of something designed for bipedal locomotion. 2 legs, powerful, purposeful strides. The gait suggested this was its natural movement pattern, not a temporary posture. The stride covered the 12-foot trail width in 3 deliberate steps, not hurried, not slow. Efficient, powerful movement that closed distance with minimal visible effort. The build was massive in a way that exceeded human proportion. The shoulders were broader than any human frame he'd ever seen, broader even than professional athletes or exceptionally large men. The measurement would have been 40 inches across at minimum, possibly wider. The arms hung longer than human proportion, the hands reaching past where the knees would be if it had been human anatomy. The torso suggested muscle structure designed for raw power rather than speed or endurance. The thickness through the chest and back created a profile that was almost rectangular from the side view. The estimate of weight, processed instinctively through years of physical presence awareness, exceeded 400 pounds, possibly 450 or 500, the kind of mass that should create heavy footfalls, that should make the ground vibrate slightly with each step, but the movement was surprisingly quiet for something that large. The covering was fur, not hair like a human, not the short coat of a bear. Dense, dark fur that caught the fading light in a way that revealed texture, black or near black, with possible dark brown undertones that were difficult to distinguish in the evening light. The fur appeared thick, perhaps 3 to 4 inches in length across the torso and limbs, longer in some areas, the shoulders, the back of the neck, possibly along the spine. The texture looked coarse, not soft or groomed, the kind of coat that suggested adaptation to cold and wet conditions, designed for insulation and water resistance. The fur moved as it walked, rippling over muscle structure in a way that emphasized the power beneath. Each stride caused the shoulder fur to shift, revealing the mechanical efficiency of the musculature driving the movement. Then it stopped, mid-trail, center of the path, and turned its head toward him. The movement was deliberate, controlled, not startled, not surprised. The head turned first, then the shoulders followed slightly, creating a 3/4 view. The creature knew he was there. It was choosing to acknowledge his presence. The face destroyed any possibility this was a bear or known animal. The structure was not human, not ape, not wolf, something that combined elements of canine and primate in a configuration that created immediate recognition. This was neither. The muzzle extended forward from the face, not flat like a gorilla's profile, not elongated like a wolf's snout, but something precisely between. The length was perhaps 6 inches from eyeline to nose tip. The width suggested powerful jaw muscles. The bone structure visible beneath the fur indicated a skull designed for bite force that would crush bone, not just tear flesh. The nose was dark, possibly black, wider than a human nose, flatter than a wolf's nose. The nostrils were large, mobile, capable of significant expansion. They flared visibly as it assessed him, drawing air in audible inhalations that carried across the 20 meters separating them. The eyes caught what remained of the daylight and reflected it back in a way that no human eyes would. The same retroreflective quality seen in dogs, cats, deer, when light hits their eyes at night. But these eyes were larger than a dog's eyes, positioned forward on the skull like a primate's eyes, suggesting binocular vision, suggesting a predator rather than a prey animal. The color was amber, or golden yellow, not the dark brown of a bear's eyes, not the gentle brown of a deer's eyes, not the yellow-green of a coyote's eyes, something between gold and copper, with an intensity that suggested more than simple light reflection. The pupils were visible as dark centers, contracted in the available light but still discernible. The eyes tracked him, not a vague awareness of movement, but focused attention, direct eye contact, assessment, the kind of gaze that showed awareness, intelligence, active calculation. The creature was processing information about him: distance, size, potential threat, potential food, potential nothing requiring response. The teeth were visible even though the mouth wasn't open in threat or aggression. The lip structure didn't fully conceal them, creating a partial view of the dental structure. The canines dominated that view. Upper and lower canines that extended well beyond human proportion. 4 inches from gum line to tip, possibly longer. Curved slightly, designed for gripping and holding, designed for penetrating and controlling prey. The kind of teeth that would lock into flesh and not release. The other teeth visible in the partial view suggested a mix of carnivore and omnivore dental structure, incisors that looked sharper than human incisors, premolars that showed grinding surfaces but also cutting edges. But the canines dominated the impression, dominated the threat assessment his brain was conducting automatically. The ears were pointed, not rounded like a bear's small ears, not small and flat like a human's ears, triangular, mobile, positioned higher on the skull than human ears would be. They moved independently, tracking sound from different directions, rotating slightly as it assessed the audio environment. The size was larger than a dog's ears, but smaller than a deer's ears. The mobility suggested acute hearing, suggested a hunting animal that located prey through multiple sensory inputs. The fur around the face was shorter than the body fur, perhaps an inch in length, allowing the underlying structure to show through more clearly. The color gradation created shadowing that emphasized the bone structure: prominent brow ridge, deep-set eyes, pronounced jawline. The neck was thick, heavily muscled, supporting the head with power that suggested strength sufficient to drag large prey. The transition from neck to shoulders showed muscle mass that exceeded any human development, even professional bodybuilders or strength athletes. The hands were visible for just seconds as it paused mid-trail, but the details registered clearly. Not paws, not human hands, something that combined elements of both in a way that suggested both gripping capability and weapon potential. 5 digits clearly visible. The fingers were longer than human fingers, probably 10 to 12 inches from palm to fingertip. The proportions suggested dexterity, suggested ability to manipulate objects, suggested intelligence capable of tool use if necessary. The nails were not nails. They were claws. Dark claws, possibly black, curved in a way that suggested both digging capacity and combat function. The length extended perhaps 2 inches beyond the fingertips, sharp enough to penetrate flesh, curved enough to grip bark for climbing, strong enough to dig through earth or tear through hide. The palms were visible in the brief moment when it shifted weight. Dark skin, possibly leathery texture, with clear pad definition. The kind of hands that would leave tracks, showing both palm and digit impressions, tracks that would measure larger than any human handprint. The legs were partially obscured by the angle and the trail-side vegetation, but the visible portions suggested power structure designed for both bipedal walking and explosive running if needed. The thighs were massive, probably 30 inches in circumference or greater. The muscle definition showed through the fur, emphasized by the movement. The feet were large, probably 16 inches long based on the proportional scaling from the visible body parts. The moment of mutual observation lasted perhaps 5 seconds, maybe 6. Time stretched in the way it does during high-stress moments, making each second feel extended, making each detail register with unusual clarity. The creature looked at him directly. The head tilted slightly, maybe 15 degrees, a gesture that seemed almost curious. Not aggressive, not threatened, curious. The way a dog tilts its head when processing an unusual sound, the gesture suggested cognitive processing, suggested thought behind the observation. The nostrils flared visibly, expanding and contracting in a pattern that indicated active scenting. The creature was drawing air across olfactory receptors, processing chemical information about him, taking his measure through smell the way a predator assesses potential threat or prey, reading fear, reading humanity, reading whatever information scent carries about another living being. His own response was instinctive before it was conscious. He froze. Complete stillness, not from decision but from ancient programming buried in the human brainstem. Every animal recognition system in his neurology registered the same conclusion. Predator. Apex predator. Larger, stronger, faster. Do not run. Do not move. Do not trigger. Chase. Response. Running would have been death. Some part of him understood that with absolute certainty. This thing could cover 20 meters faster than he could process the decision to flee. The muscle structure visible beneath the fur demonstrated explosive power. The leg configuration suggested speed that would overtake any human in seconds. Fear flooded his system. Adrenaline, elevated heart rate, rapid breathing trying to remain quiet. The physical response to mortal threat. His hands trembled slightly. His vision sharpened in the way it does when the body prepares for survival response. But beneath the fear, something else surfaced. Faith, not as abstract comfort, but as immediate conviction rising from decades of belief. God's protection exists. Whatever this is, flight isn't the answer. Panic serves nothing. If this is meant to be his time, running won't change it. If this isn't meant to be his time, God won't abandon him to this moment. The thought wasn't complex theology. It was simple trust, built through 38 years of ministry, through moments of crisis where prayer was all that remained, through experiences that had taught him faith operates independently of circumstance. His breathing steadied slightly. The trembling in his hands decreased. He didn't move, but the quality of his stillness changed from freeze response to conscious choice. He stood there, 20 meters from something that shouldn't exist, and he chose to trust rather than panic. The creature completed its assessment. Whatever conclusion it reached, whatever information it gathered through sight and scent, it decided he represented neither threat nor interest. The head turned away, movement as deliberate as when it had turned toward him. The body followed, rotating back to its original path. It continued moving to the left side of the trail, stepping into the forest with the same efficient stride it had used crossing the path. The undergrowth barely rustled despite its size. Dried leaves that should have crunched under 400+ pounds of mass made minimal sound. The movement through dense forest suggested familiarity with the terrain, suggested awareness of foot placement that avoided noise, suggested navigation through challenging terrain that seemed practiced rather than accidental. The creature knew these woods. It had moved through this forest before many times, enough to understand how to disappear despite its size. Within 10 seconds of leaving the trail, it was gone. Completely. No sound of movement, no visible disturbance of vegetation, no crashing through brush or snapping of branches, just absence where presence had been. The forest absorbed it the way water absorbs a drop of rain. He stood motionless for another 30 seconds, listening, watching, processing what had just happened. His heart rate remained elevated but controlled, his breathing steady. The shock was there, present but manageable. His brain was still trying to categorize what he'd seen, still searching for explanation within known categories, still failing to find one. Every mental framework he possessed had collapsed. Decades of outdoor experience in these woods, every documented animal species he'd encountered or learned about, every rational explanation for unusual sightings, none of it fit what he'd just observed. He backed up, slowly, quietly, keeping his eyes on the forest where the creature had disappeared. No sudden movements, no sounds that might draw attention back to his presence. 20 deliberate steps backward along the trail before he allowed himself to turn around. Then a deliberate walk back down the trail, fighting the urge to run, maintaining awareness of his surroundings. Every shadow looked potentially dangerous. every sound registered with heightened attention. The forest that had felt peaceful 45 minutes earlier now felt occupied by presence he couldn't see but knew existed. Tracks had been found over the years in muddy trail sections, prints that measured too large for human feet, too human-shaped for bear paws, 16 inches long, showing 5 distinct toe impressions with a stride that covered 6 feet between prints. These tracks appeared sporadically, never in patterns suggesting regular wildlife movement, always in areas where the forest grew dense and human traffic remained light. The Ozark region holds layers of observation that extend beyond official wildlife documentation. For generations, hunters, hikers, and locals have reported encounters with something that doesn't fit established categories. The terminology varies. Some call them wood apes, others use the term booger or wildman, old regional names that predate modern cryptozoology. The more recent term, Dogman, attempts to capture the canine characteristics that separate these reports from the ape-like descriptions associated with Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest. The distinction matters. Bigfoot reports describe primate characteristics, flat faces, human-like eyes, ape-like movement. The Ozark encounters consistently describe canine features, extended muzzles, pointed ears, visible fangs, movement that suggests both bipedal capability and quadrupedal option. These aren't confused bear sightings. The witnesses distinguish clearly between what they've seen and known wildlife. The Mark Twain National Forest, which encompasses much of the Ozark Trail system, spans 1.5 million acres. Terrain varies from ridge systems to creek bottoms, from open glades to dense hardwood forests where visibility drops to 10 meters. Cave systems penetrate the limestone foundations. Remote hollows exist where human access requires significant effort. The forest provides habitat for documented wildlife: deer, turkey, black bear, bobcat, coyote. It also provides theoretically sufficient space and resources for something undocumented to exist in small numbers without regular detection. Wildlife biologists note that new species continue to be documented globally, though large mammals in North America are considered fully catalogued. The counter-argument from those studying these encounters points to the low population density required for persistence. If these creatures exist in numbers measured in dozens rather than hundreds across the Ozark region, traditional wildlife detection methods might miss them. Trail cameras capture known animals because those animals exist in populations dense enough to regularly cross camera coverage. A species existing in truly minimal numbers, exhibiting apparent intelligence sufficient to avoid human contact, might remain at the edge of documentation. The behavioral pattern described in encounters suggests intentional avoidance. These aren't creatures attacking hikers or raiding campsites. The reports describe brief sightings, usually at distance, often involving the creature moving away from human presence. The retired clergyman's encounter fits this pattern. The creature crossed the trail, assessed him, and departed. No approach, no aggression, just passage through terrain where human and something else momentarily occupied the same space. Search dog handlers in the region have documented behavioral anomalies that resist standard explanation. Dogs that work reliably in search operations suddenly refuse to enter specific areas, not because of bear scent or hazardous terrain, but displaying fear responses their handlers describe as extreme avoidance. The dogs whine, pull backward on leads, refuse commands they normally obey. When the same dogs are moved to adjacent areas, they work normally. The specific zones of refusal cluster in areas where sightings have been reported. Scent reports accompany many encounters. A smell described consistently as sulfurous, musky, powerful enough to detect from considerable distance. Not the smell of death or decay, not the smell of bear or known animals. Something distinct that witnesses struggle to compare to anything familiar. The retired clergyman didn't report smell, possibly because the wind direction carried scent away from his position, possibly because the brief nature of the encounter didn't allow the scent to register. Vocalizations form another pattern in the accumulated reports. Sounds that begin as animal calls but shift into something between animal and human. howls that modulate in ways coyote or wolf howls don't, screams that suggest vocal cords capable of producing both deep, resonant calls and high-pitched shrieks. Witnesses familiar with all documented Ozark wildlife consistently state this doesn't match anything cataloged. Tree structures appear in specific areas, not random deadfall, not storm damage. Trees broken at 8 to 10 feet height, twisted and woven into formations that suggest intentional construction. Wildlife biologists note that bears create marking trees by scratching and rubbing, but they don't break living trees at that height or weave them into structures. The purpose of these formations remains unknown. Territorial markers, directional signs, simple expressions of strength. The structures exist in areas where sightings cluster. The retired clergyman's encounter occurred in terrain that fits the broader pattern. The Trace Creek section of the Ozark Trail runs through moderately remote forest. Road access exists but requires knowledge of local routes. This section sees regular use but not the heavy traffic of more popular trail segments. Dense hardwood forest provides cover. Creek drainages offer water sources year-round. The topography creates natural corridors and barriers that would channel movement for any large animal navigating the region. In the 2 years following his encounter, 3 other reports emerged from within a 5-mile radius of the same trail section. A bow hunter in November 2012 described something moving through the forest below his tree stand. Bipedal, too large for human, moving with purpose through terrain that would challenge experienced hikers. The hunter, a man with 30 years of hunting experience in these woods, left his stand immediately and didn't return to that area. A couple camping at a developed site in May 2013 reported vocalizations at night that sent them to their vehicle. Howls that started deep and rose in pitch. Multiple sources suggesting more than one individual communicating across distance. The sounds continued for approximately 20 minutes, moving through the forest in a pattern that suggested deliberate search or patrol behavior. Park rangers investigated the following morning, finding no evidence of unusual activity. A woman hiking with her dog in September 2013 watched her animal exhibit extreme distress while crossing a specific section of trail. The dog, a German shepherd trained for search and rescue work, refused to continue. The handler checked for snakes, bears, any visible threat. Nothing explained the dog's reaction. She carried the 75-pound animal for a quarter mile before it would walk again. 3 days later, she returned to the same section with a different handler and dog. The second dog showed identical behavior at the same location. These reports don't prove the retired clergyman saw what he described. They establish a pattern of observations in the same geographic area, describing similar characteristics, reported by witnesses with no connection to each other. The pattern exists in documented fact, not speculation. Standard explanations exist for individual elements. Bears on hind legs can appear remarkably tall. Evening light can distort perception. Fear can amplify observation into certainty about details that weren't actually clear. These explanations account for some encounters, particularly brief sightings at distance in poor light, but they don't account for the specific, detailed observations made by credible witnesses in adequate light at sufficient distance for clear viewing. The retired clergyman saw what he saw from 20 meters in fading but functional daylight. The observation lasted long enough to register multiple details: bipedal locomotion, massive build, dark fur, canine facial features, amber eyes, visible teeth, pointed ears, clawed hands. These details accumulate beyond what misidentification of known animals would produce. The creature's behavior suggests awareness and intelligence. It assessed the human presence. It chose to continue its path rather than retreat. It showed no sign of surprise or alarm, suggesting it had likely detected the human before the human detected it. The scenting behavior indicated active information gathering through smell. The calm departure suggested confidence in its ability to disappear into terrain where pursuit would be ineffective. What walked across that trail in October 2011 remains unidentified by official wildlife categories. The witness remains certain of what he observed. His faith framework processed the encounter as divine protection rather than random chance. He believes he was meant to see it. meant to turn back, meant to witness something that would deepen his understanding of creation's mysteries. He hasn't returned to that section of trail. Not from fear, but from respect. Something lives in those woods that prefers not to be found. He encountered it once. That was enough. The weeks following the encounter brought an unexpected gift. Conversations with others who'd experienced similar phenomena in the Ozark region. As word spread quietly through local networks, friends telling friends, hunters sharing stories at deer camp, hikers comparing notes on trail forums, a broader picture emerged of accumulated observations spanning decades. A logger who'd worked the Mark Twain National Forest in the 1980s described finding tracks along a creek bed where he'd been marking trees for harvest. The prints measured over a foot long, showing 5 toes, pressed deep into mud in a way that suggested significant weight. The stride between prints exceeded what any human could achieve. He'd photographed them with a disposable camera, the prints filling the entire frame, even shot from 3 feet away. He'd shown the photos to other loggers and Forest Service personnel. Most dismissed them as hoaxes or misidentified bear tracks. He stopped sharing them but kept the photos, knowing what he'd seen was neither fake nor bear. A wildlife photographer who'd spent 30 years documenting Ozark fauna described an encounter from 2003. She'd been setting up a blind near a creek crossing, a location known for deer and turkey traffic, planning to spend the night capturing dawn images. Around 2 a.m., something large moved through the water 50 yards from her position. The moon was 3/4 full, providing adequate light for her night vision scope. What she observed through the scope moved upright on 2 legs, stood approximately 7 feet tall, and crossed the creek with purposeful strides that suggested familiarity with the terrain. She packed her equipment and left. She'd never returned to that specific location despite its productivity for wildlife photography. A park ranger who'd worked the Ozark Trail system for 15 years spoke carefully about observations accumulated during night patrols, vocalizations that didn't match any animal in the field guides, tracks found in remote sections that couldn't be explained through known wildlife, tree structures that appeared between patrol cycles, constructed in ways that suggested strength far beyond human capability. He documented these findings in personal notes rather than official reports, understanding how such information would be received by supervisors and colleagues who prioritized rational explanations. The ranger described one incident from 2008 with particular precision. During a routine night patrol checking camping permits, he'd heard vocalizations coming from a ridge approximately half a mile away. The sounds started as deep, resonant howls, similar to wolf howls but with different modulation. They shifted in pitch, rising to screams that carried an almost human quality. The duration of individual calls extended beyond what canine vocal anatomy should produce. Sustained notes lasting 15 to 20 seconds without break. Multiple sources produced these calls, suggesting at least 3 individuals communicating across the ridge system. The pattern suggested coordinated movement. Calls from one location would be answered by calls from another location, then silence, then movement sounds, then calls from new positions. The pattern repeated for approximately 40 minutes, the sources gradually moving away to the north, deeper into the forest. The ranger, trained in wildlife identification and acoustic analysis, could identify every documented animal in the Ozarks by sound. Coyote, wolf, fox, bobcat, black bear, owl, elk, he knew them all. What he heard that night matched nothing in his experience or training. A family who'd owned property adjacent to the Mark Twain National Forest for 3 generations described experiences spanning 60 years. The grandfather, now deceased, had reported seeing something in the early 1960s that he described as not quite man, not quite beast. He'd been hunting deer along the property line when something large and upright crossed through the forest approximately 80 yards away. He'd watched it through his rifle scope, clear enough to observe details. Dark fur, bipedal movement, size that exceeded any human. He'd lived through the Depression, fought in World War II, spent decades in these woods. He wasn't given to exaggeration or fantasy. He told the story once to family members and never spoke of it again. The grandson, current owner of the property, reported finding tracks along the same fence line in 2010. 3 toed impressions measuring 14 inches long, pressed into soft earth with depth suggesting several hundred pounds of weight. He'd photographed them with his phone, measuring them against his own boot for scale. The tracks followed the fence line for approximately 200 yards before disappearing into rocky terrain where tracking became impossible. The accumulation of these reports, separated by decades but concentrated in the same geographic region, creates a pattern that resists simple dismissal. Individual cases might be explained through misidentification, exaggeration, or fabrication. The collective weight of multiple credible witnesses reporting similar observations across extended timeframes becomes more difficult to dismiss through conventional explanations. The Ozark Mountains themselves hold a complex history of indigenous knowledge that predates European settlement by millennia. Native American tribes who inhabited these regions for thousands of years maintained oral traditions describing wild men of the woods, creatures that walked like humans but were not human, beings that existed at the boundary between animal and spirit. These traditions weren't entertainment or mythology in the modern sense. They were practical knowledge passed between generations, warnings about what existed in the forest, guidance for avoiding specific areas or recognizing signs of presence. The knowledge served survival purposes, understanding what shared the territory, respecting boundaries, maintaining appropriate caution. When European settlers arrived in the Ozarks in the 18th and 19th centuries, they brought their own folklore. Stories of wild men, wood apes, hairy monsters in the deep forests. Some of these stories were imported from European traditions. Others emerged from encounters in the new landscape, experiences that required explanation through available frameworks. The term booger appears in Ozark folklore as early as the 1840s, not the childhood term for nasal mucus, but an Appalachian and Ozark term for something wild, threatening, and not fully understood. Booger stories were told around fires, shared between neighbors, used to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. Like most folklore, the stories contained elements of exaggeration and embellishment, but also like most folklore, they often contained cores of actual experience, observations that had been processed through cultural frameworks and transformed into narrative. The modern term Dogman emerged in the 1980s and 1990s as cryptozoology developed more specific taxonomic language for reported creatures. The distinction between Bigfoot, primate-like, and Dogman, canine-like, allowed witnesses to describe observations with more precision. The Ozark region, along with Michigan, Wisconsin, and Kentucky, became recognized as a concentration area for Dogman reports, distinct from the Pacific Northwest Bigfoot concentration. Whether these represent different species, regional variants of the same phenomenon, or completely separate entities remains a matter of debate among those who study such reports. The witnesses themselves generally care less about taxonomy than about being believed, about having their experiences acknowledged as genuine observation rather than dismissed as delusion or fabrication. The retired clergyman struggled with this aspect of his experience. The desire to be believed, the knowledge that belief would be difficult to secure, the understanding that his credibility might be questioned despite decades of reliable service. He'd built his life on truth-telling, on honesty in pastoral care, on trustworthiness in community relationships. The encounter challenged his ability to maintain that reputation while also honestly reporting what he'd witnessed. He made peace with the tension by reframing his relationship to belief. Whether others believed him mattered less than whether he remained truthful to his own experience. He'd seen what he'd seen. His faith taught that truth existed independently of human acceptance. If God's creation included things beyond human documentation, that expanded rather than contracted the scope of divine mystery. If the natural world held wonders still undiscovered, that humbled rather than threatened his understanding of reality. This theological processing allowed him to maintain integrity without requiring validation. He could share his experience honestly while acknowledging others' skepticism as reasonable, given the extraordinary nature of the claim. He could live with the tension between what he knew and what could be proven. In the final analysis, he viewed the encounter as a gift rather than a trauma. Most people lived entire lives without seeing anything that challenged their understanding of reality. They existed in comfortable certainty about what did and didn't exist in the world. He'd been given a moment of genuine mystery, a direct encounter with something that shouldn't be but was. That moment deepened his faith rather than threatening it, expanded his wonder rather than contracting his certainty. He continued walking in the Ozark forests, just not in that specific section of the Trace Creek Trail. The woods remained a place of solitude, reflection, exercise, and prayer, but they also now held an edge of possibility they hadn't contained before. Every shadow might be more than shadow. Every sound in the distance might be more than wind or wildlife. The forest had revealed itself as less fully known than he'd assumed, more capable of surprise than his experience had suggested. That awareness, that edge of possibility, that expanded sense of mystery, these became part of his daily spiritual practice. He prayed for the creature, whatever it was, that it might live unmolested in the wild spaces it called home. He prayed for other witnesses, that they might find peace with their experiences whether or not they found belief from others. And he prayed for himself, that he might remain open to mystery while maintaining the critical thinking and rational assessment that had served him throughout his life. The October evening in 2011 changed him in ways both subtle and profound. He became more careful in his judgments about others' extraordinary claims. He developed deeper appreciation for the limits of human knowledge. He found himself defending the possibility of undiscovered species in conversations where previously he might have sided with skeptics. Not because he needed to convince others of what he'd seen, but because the experience had taught him humility about certainty. The forest taught what decades of ministry had taught, that reality exceeds human capacity to fully comprehend it, that mystery remains even in well-documented landscapes, that faith and reason both require openness to evidence that challenges existing frameworks. The Ozark Trail remains open and accessible. Thousands hike its sections annually. Most encounter nothing unusual. The infrastructure functions as designed. Rangers maintain their presence. Trail conditions are monitored and documented. The forest continues its cycles independent of human awareness or classification. Within this normal operational framework, observations continue to accumulate from credible witnesses describing encounters that resist standard explanation. The retired clergyman's account adds specific detail to a pattern that spans decades in this region. His background, his credibility, his detailed recollection of precise characteristics all contribute weight to the accumulated record. Standard wildlife explanations exist. Misidentification occurs. Poor lighting distorts perception. Fear amplifies uncertainty into false certainty. These factors account for some reports, particularly brief sightings in challenging conditions. But they fail to account for detailed observations made in adequate light by experienced outdoors people who know the region's documented wildlife. They fail to explain the consistent description of specific characteristics: bipedal movement, massive build, canine features, apparent intelligence. They fail to address why search dogs refuse to work in specific zones, why tree structures appear in areas where sightings cluster, why vocalizations continue to be reported that don't match catalogued species. The gap between what witnesses describe and what official categories acknowledge remains. The Ozark National Forest provides habitat sufficient for minimal populations of large animals to persist without regular detection, if those populations maintain low density and exhibit behavioral patterns favoring human avoidance. The theoretical possibility exists alongside the practical difficulty of proving existence without physical evidence that current methods have failed to produce. The retired clergyman processed his encounter through faith. Others process similar experiences through different frameworks. The interpretation varies. The core observations remain consistent across reports separated by years and miles, but sharing geographic clustering in specific corridors of the Ozark Trail system. The creature that crossed the trail in October 2011 has not been documented in official wildlife records. It exists in witness testimony, in accumulated reports, in patterns that resist but don't completely defy explanation. Whether it represents an undocumented species, a rare behavioral variant of known animals, or something else entirely remains unresolved. If you found this examination valuable, consider supporting the channel by liking and subscribing. New documentaries are released regularly, each following the same evidence-focused approach without sensationalism or speculation. If you have documented encounters, regional knowledge, or relevant observations about similar phenomena in the Ozark region or elsewhere, you're invited to share in the comments. Careful attention to detail moves the record forward. Even when complete explanations remain elusive, the facts continue to accumulate. The explanations continue to fall short of accounting for all documented elements, and the Ozark Trail continues to wind through terrain where the observed occasionally exceeds the officially acknowledged, where witnesses continue to report encounters that challenge the boundaries between the documented and the impossible. The forest remains unchanged, the trail stays open, and something continues to move through terrain it knows far better than those who walk the marked paths.